Welcome everybody to JenTalks today. And I suppose I want to give a little background to the topic of my talk on grief. As you know, I always give a shout out to people to say if there's anyone that has a topic they'd like me to cover, to let me know. And somebody very close to me in my life asked me to discuss grief. And at first I was a little bit reluctant because like grief is one of those topics that, you can offend people, you can get it wrong, you can get it right. And then I thought, you know what? I am not the expert on any of these topics that I talk about every single week. I just bring my own wisdom, my own learned experience, and all of the training and the learning that I've done. So why would grief be any different from any other topic? And also, it is one of those topics that everybody shies away from. And even when you're faced with grief or you're experiencing grief or you know somebody that's grieving, we never know really what we're meant to do or what we're meant to say. So I thought, why not bring it here, start the conversation, and if I can help one other person in this world that hears this talk today, well, then my job is done. That makes me a happy woman. So let's dig in and see what we know about grief. So when people think about grief, the first thing they think about is, this concept of the 6 stages of grief. And actually, they've just recently added a seventh one, which is shock. And I by no means know them all off by heart, but I know there's denial, anger, depression, all these kind of stages of grief. And what has come to the forefront now is that research has actually been refuted. So in other words, what they've done is they've done further research, and the further research has shown that grief is as individual to the as unique to the individual as their fingerprint. So what we mean by that is every single human being grieves differently. And that makes so much sense to me because even when I look at my own family and the six children, my mother had 6 children, and when we lost her, every single one of us grieved differently. There wasn't one single member of the family that had the same experience of grief. How we coped with it, how we talked about it, how much it affected us was all completely different. So that was kind of my first introduction to losing somebody as close as a parent. And my grieving experience wouldn't necessarily be something to look at and think, it's a picture case book by any means. It's certainly not a case study. I actually really pushed grief away and decided to use busyness as my drug of choice to avoid kind of feeling grief. And it didn't end well. I ended up getting very sick, as many people who know me would know about me. But what I would say, what I know about grief is, when I first lost my mother, I remember seeing people on social media saying things like, oh, you think year 1 is bad, wait till year 2 gets bad, or you never get over it, or it gets worse all of the time. And when you're new to it, when you're new to a grief of that enormity, you actually don't know, what is ahead of you. So what I always feel is like by sharing with people to say that, first of all, we don't get anything in life that is bigger than us. Like grief is a part of the natural life and death process. And when we lose somebody, not initially, but eventually, it makes us more aware of our own mortality and just how precious life is. And that the moments that we do have to cherish and not to feel sorry for ourselves if we have COVID, or feel sorry for ourselves if we have a broken leg, or if we no money in the bank, or we can't go out with the weekend, and all the things that we complain about to ourselves. Grief is a reminder that there's much bigger and harder things to deal with. The other thing about grief is that, again, it's down to every single individual. Like, there are different types of grief. I mean, one of the other elements of the research that Brené Brown talks about in her new book, Atlas of the Heart, is complicated grief. And complicated grief is where people stay in that really severe grief-stricken stage that usually an average person, when we say an average person, would be kind of 2 to 3 months, that they stay in that for maybe a year or two. And the only real way that they can get out of that cycle is with professional help, and ideally somebody who is professionally trained in complicated grief. So when we look at grief, it's not the same for everybody. And also, grief is not just about losing people. You can grieve losing a job. You can grieve ending a relationship. You can grieve the ending of an experience in your life, at home. People grieve lots of different things. Grief is still the same emotion that we get caught up in, or that we get affected by. And then the other thing to say about grief is, and this is true, that time does soothe the emotion. So it's like, I always feel like grief is something that walks with you through your life, so it's always present. Sometimes you notice that it's there, and sometimes you're carrying it on your back. Sometimes you're pushing it up a hill. Sometimes you're dragging it along behind you, but it's always present, but it's not always as painful as the moments and the bursts of extreme grief. And I remember when, I don't know whether it was my friend, and sorry, it was when I lost my mom or my friend lost her dad. But I remember a very good friend of mine saying to me, grief is like falling into a hole. And the very first time you fall in there, it's completely dark and it's scary and it's horrible and there's no light and it's a very deep hole. And eventually you get to climb out of that hole and you walk a little bit further down the road and then you fall into the hole again. And as you go further down the road on your journey, the holes become further apart and they become smaller and they become a little bit more bright. So if they're not so deep, there's a lot more light getting into them. And that's what it's like. So sometimes we get triggers. It might be something like Mother's Day, it could be somebody's anniversary or birthday, or if it's to do with, say, a relationship or a job ending, different things can set us off for that. And they're the moments where we might fall back into the hole. But we don't stay in the hole for as long. We have the tools to kind of get back out and feel the sun on our face again, knowing that sometime in the future there will be another hole that will fall down, but it won't be as deep and it won't be as scary. So the point I'm going to finish on, I hope that's helpful for people who may be new to grief or had their new experience, to understand that, people might say, oh, it gets worse, or people might say you never get over it, or, the longer it goes on, the worse you feel. That's their experience of grief. And that might be true for them. It probably is true for them if that's what they're actually choosing to post on social media, but that doesn't mean it's true for you. You have your own relationship with grief. One of the tips I was given when I went to grievance counseling was to grieve with the person, to actually talk to the person, to tell them how much I miss them, to tell them how much I love them, to talk to them every single day. And I still do that to this day. I still talk to my mother and I tell her the good news and I tell her the bad news, sometimes out loud, sometimes in my head, but I'm always grieving with her because I'm always talking to her. And I'm always telling her, how much I miss her. And when something good happens, I tell her the good news, and it just helps me feel connected to her. So that's really helpful. That was a really helpful tip for me. And then I suppose to just say that, grief is a natural emotion that we give ourselves. We kind of have a period, particularly in this country, that we have a window with people of tolerance of maybe like 2 weeks. So we say, okay, well, somebody's kind of a bit down in the dumps because they're grieving, and like we give them 2 weeks, then all of a sudden they expect to just pick themselves up and dust themselves off and carry on as if it's normal. And realistically, experts say that the grieving process, the initial grieving process, is between 1 to 2 years. 1 to 2 years is where we're really in a place that's new to us, that we've never been before. And what we mean by that is that grief changes the neurological shape of your brain. It changes the way your brain operates. Your memory declines, your ability to think fast on your feet, your ability to decision make, to think clearly, to separate your reaction versus respond methods, and even down to the point of your emotional connection. So sometimes your emotions are really driving your decisions as opposed to your logical, rational brain. And when we know that about ourselves, then we can say, okay, well, I'm grieving. Maybe that's not the best time to move house or to make it a major life-changing decision, because it might be coming from a part of your brain that would normally be functioning differently. And then the last point I'm going to finish on, for anyone who is experiencing somebody who is going through grief, what we tend to do is we tend to meet them and say, oh, I won't bring up, sorry to hear about your mom, because it might remind them or it might upset them. And I say that from experience. I was one of those people that used to think like that. And now I know that when you do lose somebody, you never forget. It's not like them saying to you, oh, I'm sorry to hear you lost your mom. It's going to upset you because you remember it. You never forget it. But the fact that they've said it makes you feel seen and heard and held. And that's the most important thing. People who are grieving really need support. They need people to reach out to them and not treat them like they're invisible or the person that has been lost didn't exist. So by reaching out, so if you ever have a question in your mind, should you send a message? Should you send something through social media, Facebook, text message, email? Reaching out to people who have lost somebody is a really powerful way of showing your support. And it's only when you've lost somebody you realize just how much that support means to you. And you don't have to know them really well. You don't have to have seen them in the last 5 years or, do I know them well enough to text them that you're thinking of them or send them some sort of condolences. Every little support helps when you're going through that process, particularly the early stages. And support is the only thing really that can give you comfort, apart from the relationship that you might have had with that person or how you got a chance to say goodbye or how they lived their life, or even your own spiritual beliefs. You may have spiritual beliefs that they still live on. But realistically, from the point of view of what other people can do for you, all other people have is their support to show you. So if you're one of those other people and you know somebody that might be in the throes of grief or struggling with grief, support is your gift to them, and it's the only gift that you can give them, being there for them and showing them empathy. So next week, actually, funny enough, I'm going to talk about empathy, and I'm going to talk about it in a big way. I'm going to talk about what empathy is and what empathy isn't, and the barriers to empathy. So that will tie in nicely to grief. And then if you're interested in looking at how you can show somebody empathy and compassion in any circumstances or any context, join me again next Tuesday at 2:00. There's a little bit before the hour, but you should catch it at 2. And if you're watching this live, you will remember that the Wellbeing Network is on the last Tuesday of every month. So that's tonight. And I will be talking with Karen Gaynor, who is an inspirational woman who used intermittent fasting to cure her body of a major illness and major pain. A byproduct, of course, of intermittent fasting is also weight loss, but so are many other byproducts: energy, moods, happy hormones, a balance in your menstrual cycle, menopause, all of that stuff. And she'll be on talking about the science and the data and the statistics behind it, and of course her own inspirational life story. So if you have any curiosity about intermittent fasting, join us tonight. If you don't make it tonight, next month will be Sue Mullen, and she'll be talking and teaching people how to use tapping, using positive emotional freedom technique, which is also known as positive EFT. So stay tuned. And if you're not watching it live and you feel like post in a comment, I'll get back to you. And if there's any topics that you'd like me to cover, feel free to post them in the comment box and I will put it on the list of talks for the year. So thank you so much again for joining me. And if you like what you've heard or seen, please free to spread the word, because really JenTalks is about getting some positive wisdom out to as many people as possible. And you can help one person every single day in your life. Imagine how many people you'll help in a lifetime. So take care, enjoy the rest of the week, and I shall speak to you all this time next week. Thanks again for joining me here at JenTalks.